Well, the varsity calendar has kicked off. South Africa's future leaders will officially resume classes over the coming days. Some will be attending university for the very first time. This week, we bring you a special series of our Need to Know feature. The Moneyline team spent some time at Wits Orientation Week and gathered questions from students. As usual, the experts took time out of their busy schedules to provide some answers.
I didn't do economics as a subject at school. I was wondering what the difference is between macro and microeconomics.
Broadly speaking, micro and macro refer to the small and the large, the behavior of individual economic operators or agents, and the behavior, on the other hand, of large aggregates. Now, what's interesting about this question, of course, is that the relationship between the micro and the macro level, and indeed the distinction between the two, is the subject of much debate in economics. Some economists, for example in the neoclassical tradition, would argue that what happens at the macro level obeys the same kinds of rules as what happens at the micro level. So there is a macroeconomics, but it's very similar to the microeconomic approach. On the other hand, for example, Keynes and other economists like Kaletsky have argued that the aggregation of individual decisions, for example, individual savings and investment decisions that make up the large aggregates, generate behaviors that are radically different and obey different kinds of laws from what happens at the micro level. Now, another thing that I think is very important for anyone starting to study economics is to think that yes, we have this distinction, which also transfers, by the way in which we think about policies. So industrial policy, trade policy, competition policy are typically seen as microeconomic policies because they deal with companies. On the other hand, monetary policy or fiscal policy are seen as macroeconomic policy.
Well, next week, the Finance Minister is expected to deliver his budget speech. This week, Moneyline brings you a special feature. Economists and analysts offering some ideas that the Minister should take note of. Tonight, our first Notes for Nene comes from Stanlib Chief Economist Kevin Lings.
It would be nice if the Minister started to focus more on diverting money from consumption-related expenditure into more and more fixed investment or infrastructure development. We know that over the past couple of years, the consumption component of South Africa's budget has increased substantially. That relates to salaries and wages, total employment, social grants, and many other commitments government has. And obviously, many of those commitments are very important, but they've come at the cost of slowing infrastructure development. And there's no doubt that when we look at South Africa's growth rate, South Africa is in urgent need of additional infrastructure. The most obvious is electricity, but it's much broader than that. And I think that local, provincial government could play a much more significant role in trying to uplift South Africa's infrastructure. And clearly we need to try and divert money away from consumption into more and more fixed investment without necessarily increasing the total expenditure of the government or having to increase debt substantially. So it simply means reallocating expenditure, being more strategic on what we're spending our money on, and trying to make sure that a bigger proportion of the money that we're spending goes to the future growth of this country. And I think that would be very encouraging for the private sector and obviously private business.
And that's it for today's edition of eNCA Moneyline. Thank you so much for watching. You can get in touch via email on moneyline@enca.com or tweet us using the handle @eNCA News with the hashtag eNCA Moneyline. Good night.